Hello, and welcome to the Scale Toolkit series by Global School Forums. My name is Julie Bélanger, and I'm a director at Better Purpose. We've been working with the Global Schools Forum as part of the Impact at Scale Labs program. So our mission with the Scale Toolkit series is to empower early-stage educational organizations in low and middle-income countries, providing them with the tools and best practices they need to scale effectively, sharing our learnings from the Impact at Scale Labs program. Today, we'll be diving into the MEL Framework. It's a tool designed to strengthen your solution along all three components of the DVF framework. For those unfamiliar, DVF stands for desirability, viability, and feasibility. And the DVF framework is central to our approach, outlining the fundamental components that can indicate your organization is getting prepared for scale. If you haven't yet undertaken the DVF assessment, we highly recommend doing so because it can help you reflect on your priorities and understand how this specific tool, the MEL framework, aligns with your overall journey to scale. You can easily find it in the Scale Toolkit website. But for now, let's dive into the MEL framework. Now, what is a MEL framework? Imagine a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework as your project's navigation system. It provides you with the means to continuously check your direction, measure your distance, and understand the terrain ahead. It's a comprehensive plan that helps ensure that your project is performing effectively and offers the tools to adjust your course based on the insights you are gaining along the way. This strategic instrument not only guides you towards your destination, but it actually enhances your journey, making every step more insightful and impactful. So a MEL framework is a systematic approach to tracking the project's progress. So that's the first component, monitoring. To understanding its impact, that's the second component, evaluation. And to use those insights to improve your implementation and also any future initiatives. And that's the learning component. Why would you want to use it? Well, first of all, it helps you make a better project. Really, monitoring is seen as this back and forth conversation that guides the project's choices along the way. It's not just something you do alongside your project. It really is part of your project. It allows you to set these formal moments for you and your team to sit together, to stop, and focus on some important questions you're asking yourself that will enable you to answer some questions and then adjust the project if needed, depending on those answers as you're collecting evidence and data along the way. So that means that it enables learning, which enables improvements along the way. But it's also about being accountable. Any requirements you might have for reporting, for example, by some donors or funders or some of your stakeholders that you have, you want to keep in mind when you're developing your MEL framework and incorporate those elements so that your MEL activities enables you to do this reporting as well and be held accountable for your project and how you're spending any funds. Your MEL framework is useful in assessing all three components of the DVF framework. So that's the desirability, the feasibility, and the viability. On desirability, the question is the innovation engaging the intended audience and having the intended impact on outcomes? And your MEL framework is going to enable you to answer those questions. On feasibility, the question is whether the culture and leadership that you have in your team is able to use data and learning. And do you have the skills to implement this MEL framework? And finally, on viability, are the systems in place to deliver MEL as you scale? Are we developing data maturity along the way? How do you develop a MEL framework? Well, the first very important starting point is your theory of change. Now, if you've not yet developed your theory of change, we recommend that you check out the chapter on the theory of change development, and then you come back later to do this MEL framework. So the theory of change will feed directly into your MEL framework, and that's going to ensure that your MEL framework is systematic, comprehensive, and really meaningful for your project. The MEL framework at its core basically needs to be clear about four things. What questions do you want to answer? Why are those questions important to you? How will you find the answers to those questions? And who will be responsible for doing that? So At a big picture, those are the things you're trying to accomplish with your MEL framework. You can build your MEL framework really one step at a time. The first step is, which components of your theory of change do you need to reflect on? It could be all of them, or it could be a subset of them. Secondly, what monitoring questions are important? What questions for each of those theory of change components do you want to be asking? Third, why is each one of those questions important to you? What's the purpose behind the question? What would good look like for each one of those questions? What does success look like? You want to be clear about, if everything goes well on this component, this is what we're hoping to see. Number 5, where will you find the data to answer each of these questions? Number 6, for each question, how will you know if you've been successful? How will you know? Number 7, when and how often will you need to ask each question? Number 8, which is the last step, who's going to be responsible for answering the question? So those are the 8 basic steps of developing your MEL framework. Now, the next page defines each of these steps in more detail. I will not go through each one of these in detail right now. You can do that on your own. You will have access to these definitions. But one thing I do want to bring your attention to is the distinction between data sources and indicators, because often these two get confused. So data sources refer to where you can find the information needed to answer the monitoring questions. This could be student assessments, it could be surveys, it could be interviews, reports, lesson observations, many, many different things. Indicators refer precisely to what evidence you will need to extract from those data sources to assess against your success criteria of what success looks like. These could be quantitative. So for example, assessment data, scores, student scores, survey responses, proportions, those are quantitative type indicators, or they can be qualitative as well, but they need to be measurable. So that's the difference between those two elements. Now, there's many ways to develop a MEL framework, but this is an example, and our tool is based on this spreadsheet. It's easy to do this on a spreadsheet. So the tool that we're providing that you will be able to access really is a spreadsheet with different tabs, basically. Now, the different columns outline the different components of your MEL framework, and they link to each component of your theory of change, which is the rows, the different rows on your table here. Let's use an example to illustrate what this might look like. So Dignitas is one of the Global Schools Forum Impact at Scale Labs finalists. And as part of the work through this lab, they've developed a theory of change and a MEL framework for their Lead Now app, which is a tech tool to support remote coaching of school leaders and enhance the school-based teacher development in Kenya. Now, their ambition with this tool is to eventually reach over 4,000 schools and targeting a total of over 16,000 educators. So in order to help them get there, they've developed a very comprehensive theory of change and associated very comprehensive MEL framework. So first, let me just show you the theory of change to give you a bit of context. Now, I won't go into it in very much detail at all here. You can do this on your own as well. You will have access to these slides. But in essence, this theory of change breaks down the problem that this app is hoping to address, how the kinds of activities and how these activities will lead to the outputs, the immediate outputs, to eventually outcomes and contribute to the longer term goals ultimately. And in developing this theory of change, they broke down different types of outputs and outcomes. And these are some of the ones that I would like to use as examples to show you how to fill out your MEL framework. So let's take one output and one outcome from the Lead Now app theory of change. So here is the table that is basically the template from the MEL framework with, again, the different columns representing the different components of the MEL framework, starting with the theory of change component on the left. So now you see why it's important to do your theory of change first. So as I said, we're just using two examples, one of the outputs and one of the outcomes. In reality, the MEL framework will contain each one of the components of the theory of change in the different rows. Now let's look at the first output. So the first output example is instructional leaders are enthusiastic about enhancing foundational skills. So they're hoping that by using the app, that the school leaders who will use this app will become more enthusiastic about helping to enhance foundational skills. So the monitoring question, there may be many, but one example of a monitoring question you may want to ask about that is, to what extent do instructional leaders exhibit positive attitudes towards learning foundational skills? And the reason we want to ask this question, the rationale, is to understand whether the app's content and the learning associated with it are positively received by the leaders who are using the app. The success criteria would be that the great majority of leaders, maybe even 100% of the leaders, would show positive attitudes towards learning skills for improving foundational learning. It's important in your success criteria to have a target. You don't want to just say leaders show positive attitudes, because then you won't know. If you only have 2 or 3 leaders that show positive attitude, is that enough? Do you find that that's a success? Or would you expect the majority of, or the great majority, or maybe 100% of the leaders? So it's important to reflect on what target you want to get in your success criteria here. Where will you find the information? Potentially through a survey where you ask leaders using the app about their attitudes towards foundational learning at different points in time. And the indicators, the evidence that you would use to assess this question would be the average proportion of leaders who show positive attitudes on those survey items that are related to learning foundational skills and foundational concepts. So if you have 2 or 3 questions on your survey, you would extract those questions, you would look at the average proportion of teachers or of leaders who are showing positive attitudes, and then you would compare that to your success criteria to know if you're going in the right direction. The frequency you may need to look at this information could be potentially halfway through the program and at the end of the program. And you'll need to have a person that is identified as responsible for developing the survey and implementing it and looking at the data and seeing how it answers your question. So let's look at the second example, which is an outcome. So outcomes are later in the causality chain in your theory of change. The idea with this app is that school leaders would use this coaching app to learn about skills that would enable them to support teachers in their school, so that teachers can then change their practices, improve their practices with their students in order to lead to better learning outcomes. So the outcome here is about teacher behavior change, which comes a bit later. And in this case, it's about teachers reviewing and using learner data to adjust their teaching in the classroom. So a specific monitoring question you might ask about this could be, for example, to what extent do teachers use learner data to adjust their teaching? The reason for asking that would be to assess whether the app leads to behavior changes in teachers' practices around assessment-informed practices. And the success criteria for this one might be that following the program, at least a quarter of the teachers are showing assessment-informed practices, and that this would increase maybe over 6 months period of time. So maybe we don't expect to see 100% of teacher behavior change right away, because we know that causality will take time for the school leaders to support the teachers to change their behavior in the classroom, and that this might take time. And so that's why perhaps the target is lower than 100%. Now, where will you find this information? Potentially, you can use lesson observations, and your indicators might be the average proportion of teachers who use learner data to adjust their practices during the lessons that are being observed. And how frequently do you want to look at this? It might be you need a baseline at the beginning of the program to see if there's improvement over time, maybe 2 or 3 months after the program, and maybe even 6 months after the program as well. And again, you'll need somebody assigned to being responsible for developing the observation tool and making sure the data being collected and are being examined and analyzed. So hopefully this brings a bit of concrete example and a bit of clarity around how to develop your monitoring framework. So how do you use the tool itself? So the tool has 5 tabs, and together these tabs represent the moving pieces of the MEL framework, and they come together to help you understand your program. The first one, the first tool, is actually pretty easy. It's Guidance tab, and it provides an overview of the structure of the document. So you don't need to do anything other than read this first tab. So it's very straightforward. The second tab is the one where you will see the overarching questions that you should be asking for each of the different components of your theory of change. This is also the tab where you can actually copy and paste your theory of change, which can be useful because then you will have it handy to develop the rest of your framework. So this here is the example of the Lead Now app theory of change that's been pasted onto the second tab. The third tab is the Monitoring Universe. This represents a systematic and comprehensive breakdown of all of the different components of the theory of change and all of the possible monitoring questions you might ask. And it's important to do this so that you know that you're not missing anything. But also, it's impossible to measure everything, so you will have to prioritize. So from this third tab, you will move on to the fourth tab, where you're going to prioritize. Now, this is your monitoring plan itself. So this is where you will take the priority questions and paste them into here, into this fourth tab. How do you prioritize? Well, you want to think about which questions align most with your strategic priorities. What are your reporting needs to your donors? Because you want to make sure you put in those questions and collect the data associated with those. You want to think about your available resources, including the existing data sources that you already have, and what's practical and feasible for you in terms of data collection to answer these questions. And based on the answers to that, you will prioritize your questions for each of the components of the theory of change that you feel you want to be answering. And you will really be clear about the rationale, the success criteria, the data sources, the indicators, the timing, and the owner for each one of those. So that's the fourth tab. Finally, the last tab. This is the tab that contains the list of all of the data sources that are in your monitoring plan, which is the previous tab in tab 4, and also the target group for those data sources. So for example, if you have in your previous tab, you said you will have a survey of teachers, and you will have a survey of school leaders, and you will have lesson observations, then these would all be listed in the rows here. And you would say who the target group is, and you would have a person responsible for developing those tools as well. So it's useful to have everything in one place so you can make sure you've developed everything and you're using them when you're supposed to as well. So this is the last tab of your framework. So in a nutshell, that's it. That's how you develop your MEL framework. Now, I would highly recommend that you work on this collaboratively with your team, that it's not just a single person that is responsible for this, because remember that this needs to be part of your project. It's not something that is done on the side. It needs to be data that's continuously being gathered and reflected upon by everybody on the team. So your monitoring framework will only be as good as the use you make out of it. So good to involve as many people as possible. So you can click for the interactive template here in order to be able to use it. Now that you've explored the MEL framework, you're better positioned to enhance your strategy, especially in your desirability, viability, and feasibility aspects of that DVF tool we mentioned earlier. So to gain a comprehensive perspective on your strategy, you can revisit your DVF assessment scores. Now, if you've not yet taken the assessment, now's the perfect time. It offers this holistic view and illustrates how tools like this MEL framework align with your broader scaling objectives. Global School Forum is with you in your journey to scale. For additional strategy tools and inspiring case studies, you can visit the Scale Toolkit website. And we will see you on the journey.